about those two. Tom Mitchell.
But it's funny that you mentioned dozens, Jim and Christy, because the start of this book occurred when I was working at the Historical Museum. I think it would be 2 summers ago. And I was working with Judy Buehler-Baumann, and we were talking about the 1919 triple homicide, and of course that's before either one of us were born. But we were talking about various things, and the topic of murder in Monroe came up, and the one that she remembered was the Ned Hartwig murder. And she said, "Do you remember, what do you know about that?" And I guess I sort of remembered that it occurred, but I didn't know much about it at all. She said, "Well, I have a magazine at home. I'll let you look at it, because one of the stories in this magazine, Official Detective, was 15 cents. This is the August 1942 edition. One of the stories in here was about the Hartwig murder. Now, the headline writer wasn't the fellow that wrote the story, and it was called here, Wisconsin's Great Galloping Domino Slaying. It had nothing to do with dominoes. Those of you of a certain age, well, they're shooting craps. It involved a craps game. And, you know, these, in the 1940s, they knew how to write detective stories. And, turns out that this was one magazine that she had. And then it turns out that Susie Regetz, whose father was the DA at the time, she had a second Police Gazette type thing. So I sort of was interested, and that led me, I thought, well, let me look in the Monroe paper. So this was May 2nd, 1942. So I went to the Evening Times, and of course, big headlines when a fella gets shot through his living room window. But as a sidebar to this article, it said, like many newspapers do, they sort of gave a recap. This is the 3rd murder in the history of Monroe. And they listed number 1 and number 2. And number 1 turned out to have occurred in 1869, and all they did is give the date, January 13th, 1869, Angeline Schroyer shot and killed Patrick Crichton. And then the 2nd murder in the village of Monroe occurred at a tavern on the east side. Fred Lechty was shot and killed by George Bursey, January 31st, 1911. And then the fellow that did the shooting stumbled outside, shot himself. He died on the east side of the square, too. The Hartwig murder was the 3rd, as far as I can tell. Now, some of you may know more about this one than I do. There was the house that Bob Wolf lived in, near the old overhead bridge. Was there a Lutzy? Was he involved in this? I haven't been able to find anything out about that one. So that may have been, that was 1931, so that would be the 3rd. The Times missed that one. They said Hartwig was the 3rd. And then there's been very few in Monroe history, believe it or not. And then since 1960, I think there have been 2 that were murder-suicides. But I read the Monroe Sentinel in 1869, and they, of course, covered the murder because it occurred not 100 yards from where we are right now. There was a hotel just beyond the parking lot. We knew it as the Monroe Hotel. Well, it was the Monroe House. All the hotels were the house, 3-pound house. Then, and that's where it occurred. And just right up here, hotel. We remember it was here in the 60s. I don't know, sometime in the 70s it may have been torn down. I remember it because the Donnerbecks, were friends of my parents, ran the hotel, and Louise had a parrot.
Yeah. I saw this.
Remember that? Yep. Remember that? Okay. So anyway, I had this 1869, and the newspaper had a story, and it was a weekly newspaper, and the next week there was a story about an inch, and then it sort of went away for a while. And then the trial was in September, and there was no lead up to the trial. The week after the trial, they had a short column giving the results of the trial. And basically that was it. There wasn't a lot of material to go on. But one of the newspaper articles mentioned, after the trial, the Sentinel mentioned that they were not going to publish all the testimony, all the salacious, nasty testimony that was only the Chicago papers would print something like that. So of course I was real curious. And I actually thought, well, maybe I'll look in the Chicago papers for 1869, and I did for the Daily Tribune, and I didn't see anything. And then I realized they must have just been the kind of thing that a Chicago paper would have talked about. And that was it. I thought, well, that's an interesting story, but there's not much to go on. And then Tom Fay and I went over to UW-Platteville, to the Wisconsin room, which I think is in the Union at Platteville. And it turns out that all county records, when the county runs out of space, or think about it, 150 years of records, at some point you'd like to find a better home for them. Well, they all go over, at least from Greene County, they ended up over at the Wisconsin room. So Tom and I were over there, and we were researching something completely different. I think it was Joe Payne, or I don't know, Jacob Andrick or something. I just sort of wrote along. And they have a computer, and you can type in a name. And I thought, well, let me just type this in. So I did, and I got some hits, and I asked the librarian, I said, what does this mean when it says, this and this? She says, oh, we have the trial transcripts. I said, well, could I look at it? Well, sure. She disappeared into the back and got it. And I said, well, could I photocopy it? She said, sure, here's a photocopy machine. So it's 80-some pages written in longhand. We were only there for an afternoon, so I really didn't have time to read it all, but I thought, well, this might be interesting. So I photocopied it, and it was 80-some pages, Greene County Circuit Court, State of Wisconsin versus Angeline Schroyer, September term, 1869. Douglas was a district attorney. Her attorney was Medbury. Jury trial, September 14th, 1869. And the clerk of the court then wrote it out in longhand. A little bit different than a court record today. Today, I'm sure the court recorders, and I don't know if, I think they still actually, they're like stenographers, and they must be really fast, but I don't think it's an electronic, like a tape. I think they're actually typing, but I think it's phrases. Does anybody really know how it works? Yes?
Yeah, it's a special machine that they type into that basically is like a shorthand machine. But even today, they still use that as a way of recording the proceedings, more so than an electronic recording of the.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, they didn't do it like this in 1869, obviously. And I got they didn't do the opening statements closing statements. Apparently the only really important stuff was the testimony. I don't know why, if it goes to appeals or something like that, they actually wanted what did the witnesses say, not what did the attorney say. So there wasn't a lot of that, and the questions weren't written, only the answers. But after a little bit, you know, there'd be well, I lived in Adams. It was on the second floor. It was in the spring, and you can sort of, after a while, you can figure out what the questions must have been by reading the answers. So it was a little bit of a detective work. So this was a trial testimony, and then the one thing they did do was the charge to the jury that the judge gave. I found that too. And as we'll find out in a minute, she was involved in a civil suit against this fellow that she ultimately shot. And there were subpoenas issued, and all of that was over there at UW Platteville. The sheriff notarizing the subpoenas that he served. So then I thought, wow, you know, now I've got some material, and you can sort of fill in the blanks and tell a little bit more of what really happened. So with Larry's help, Larry Phillips is back there, he's my publisher. He's the one that made the first book happen, and we're now working on the second book. It's a slow process with us, since we don't do this for a living. But we sort of we were testing out covers, and we order up a book just to see what it looks like. I've got the text probably pretty much finished, but I want to go through and put pictures at certain, you know, on page 3, if we're talking about something, I'd like a picture of it there. So we haven't quite figured out how to do that yet, but that's the next step, and it'll probably be the final step. But in the course of doing research for a book like this, you learn a lot, obviously, about Monroe history, let alone put aside the murders and things like this. I was interested in the jury system because in 1869 they had grand juries. You've all heard of a grand jury. They also had petite juries. And the petite juries were the pool from which the trial juries were selected. And the names of the grand jurors and the petite jurors were listed, and it was pretty obvious these were all men. There were no women involved. So that was something. When in fact did women ever get on a jury? And it wasn't until after they had the right to vote. It wasn't until the 20s, and it varied in state by state. Some states down south, as late as the 1960s and 70s, did not allow women on juries. And it wasn't until a Supreme Court decision, I think in 1975, that finally said, listen, women can be in juries. But that was an example of what I learned, just sort of as a sidebar into this. The jail figures prominently in this story. And you probably know the story. The jail is just a couple blocks off the square. Now it's the jail that we grew up with is now the jailhouse tap. But before that, it was the county jail. And I was actually on a brewery tour last weekend. And of course, we all get out in the street, and she's talking about how the beer goes underneath the road from over here to the bottling plant. And then she looks up and says, do you see that? And of course, these are mostly out-of-town people. Yeah. And she said, well, back in '06, there was a fire, and the jail burned down, but they saved the brewery by pouring beer on it. I got to laugh. It's true that one of the first wooden jail did catch fire, and the brewery was there, as you know, 1845, I think, that brewery's been there.